cooperation. That is to say, why people are willing to act for the greater good rather than their narrow self-interest. And in thinking about that question, there's sort of both a basic science part of understanding how the sort of selfish process of natural selection and strategic reasoning could give rise to this kind of cooperative behavior. And then there's also the practical question of what we can do to actually make people more cooperative in real world settings where they're not as cooperative as one might like. And the way that I think about this is at sort of two general different levels. One is sort of institutional level of saying, how can you arrange interactions in a way that makes people inclined to cooperate? And most of that boils down to, more or less, how do you make it in people's long-run self-interest to actually be cooperative? And then the other part is trying to understand at a sort of more mechanistic level or psychological level, cognitive level, what's really going on inside people's heads while they're making cooperation decisions. And in particular, in situations where there's not actually any self-interested motive to cooperate, lots of people still cooperate, and so want to understand how exactly that happens. And so in the terms of the first part of like what it is that we can do to get people to be more inclined to cooperate, the short version of it is, if you think about the puzzle of cooperation being, why should I incur a personal cost of time or money or effort in order to do something that's going to benefit other people and not me? The general answer is that if you can create future consequences for present behavior, that can create an incentive to cooperate. So cooperation requires me to incur some cost now, but if I'm cooperating with someone who I'll interact with again in the future, then it's worth it for me to pay the cost of cooperating now in order to get the benefit of them being willing to cooperate with me in the future, as long as there's a large enough likelihood that we interact again. Or even if it's with someone that I'm not going to interact with again, if other people are observing that interaction, then it affects my reputation. And so it can be worth paying the cost of cooperating in order to earn a good reputation. Also to attract new interaction partners, to not get ostracized, all of these sorts of things. And so there's a lot of evidence that shows not only does this work in theory, that is, there's game theory models and computer simulations showing that if you build in these kinds of future consequences, you can get either evolution to lead to cooperative agents sort of dominating populations, and also learning and strategic reasoning leading to people cooperating. There's also lots of behavioral experiments supporting this kind of thing. So lab experiments where you bring people into the lab and you give them money and you have them engage in these kind of economic cooperation game type interactions. So they get the money and they choose whether to keep it for themselves or to contribute it to a group project that benefits other people. If you make it so that future consequences exist in any of these various ways, it makes people more inclined to cooperate. And typically it actually leads to cooperation paying off and actually being the best performing strategy. And so in these sorts of situations, it's not really altruistic to be cooperative, because the interactions are designed in a way that makes cooperating pay off. So, for example, we have a paper that shows that in the context of repeated interactions, there's not any relationship to how altruistic people are and how much they cooperate. Basically, everybody cooperates, even the selfish people. And under certain situations, selfish people can actually wind up cooperating more because they're better at identifying that that's what really is gonna pay off. So this general class of solutions to the cooperation problem that boil down to create future consequences and therefore make it self-interested in the long run to be cooperative. And so I think this kind of strategic cooperation is extremely important and explains a lot of real world cooperation and from an institution design perspective is a really important thing for people to be thinking about. Like, how do you set up rules of interaction and sort of interaction structures and incentive structures in a way that makes working for the greater good a good strategy. But it's also but at the same time that this kind of strategic cooperation is really important, it's also very clearly the case that often people cooperate even when there's not a self-interested motive to do so. And that sort of willingness to help strangers or to not exploit strangers is a really core piece of well-functioning societies. It makes society much more efficient when you don't constantly have to be watching your back and being afraid that people are going to take advantage of you. If you can generally trust that other people are going to sort of do the right thing, and you're going to do the right thing, it makes life much more efficient, socially efficient, that is. Mm-hmm. And so you have the question of, okay, well, strategic incentives can motivate people to cooperate, but also clearly people keep cooperating even when there's not incentives to do so. At least they cooperate to some extent. And so there's a question of what motivates people to do that. And a lot of the way behavioral economists and psychologists talk about that is at a sort of proximate psychological level, saying things like, well, it feels good to cooperate with other people, you care about others, and so that's why you're willing to pay costs to help them, you have social preferences, things like that. And I believe that, and I think that that is clearly true just from personal introspection as well as interaction with other people. But I'm interested in a slightly different question, which is sort of, where do those social preferences come from? Like, why is it that we care about other people, that we have those kinds of feelings? And also at a sort of cognitive level, how does that actually get implemented? And another way of asking this question is basically, are we predisposed to be selfish, and we only get ourselves to be cooperative and work for the greater good by exerting self-control and rational deliberation and saying no, override those selfish impulses and do the right thing? Or are we predisposed towards cooperating, and then in these situations where it doesn't actually pay, if we stop and think about it, sort of rationality and deliberation leads us to be selfish by overriding the sort of impulse to be a good person and help other people. Most people, both in the scientific world and among lay people, are of the opinion of the former, which is that we are by default selfish and we have to use sort of rational deliberation to make ourselves do the right thing. But I tried to think about this question from a sort of theoretical, principled position to say, what should it be? Like, from a perspective of either evolution or strategic reasoning, like, which of these two stories actually makes more sense? And should we expect to observe? And so if you're thinking about it that way, the key question is, where do our intuitive defaults come from? And there's all of this work in behavioral economics and psychology on heuristics and biases that suggests that what these kinds of intuitions are is they're usually rules of thumb for the behavior that typically works well. So it makes sense. If you're going to have something as your default, what should you choose as your default? You should choose the thing that works well, and that works well in general. And then in any particular situation, you might stop and say, well, does my rule of thumb actually fit this specific situation? And if not, then you can override it. And so if you think about things from that perspective, then what should be the default is determined by what behavior typically works well. And in the context of cooperation, because of all of these forces that I was talking about earlier, like repeated interactions and reputation consequences and things like that, I would argue that it's typically in your long-run self-interest to be cooperative, at least if you're living in a society where there are good institutions and norms that prescribe cooperation, or working in an organization that's like that. And so you should wind up internalizing cooperation as your default response because it typically works well. And then when you find yourself in interactions where you could actually get away with being selfish, your first impulse should be to cooperate like normal. But if you stop and think about it, you might realize, oh, actually, here it's different, and I should sort of overrule that kind of impulse to help and just look out for myself. In some sense, the birth of all of this work on cooperation is the Cold War, in that the prisoner's dilemma, which is the sort of workhorse of all of this research, was invented at Rand Corporation as a way of thinking about arms races and Cold War issues. And that is the key idea of the prisoner's dilemma being there's this tension between what is unilaterally optimal versus what's jointly optimal. And so then there was the question of, okay, how do you get the prisoner's dilemma? How do you get cooperation to succeed in the prisoner's dilemma? And amongst evolutionary biologists in the early 70s, Trivers suggested the idea of reciprocal altruism. That is, if you have repeated interactions, it can make cooperation advantageous in a prisoner's dilemma. And then Axelrod in the 80s had his famous prisoner's dilemma tournament where different people submitted strategies and they played against each other and they saw what won. And that really moved things forward a lot because it introduced this strategy of tit for tat, which starts out by cooperating and then imitates the other person's previous action. So it's a very simple strategy that is basically just implementing the logic of reciprocity. It says, I'll do to you whatever you did to me before. And so if you know the other person is playing tit for tat, then you maximize your payoff by cooperating so that tit for tat will cooperate with you in the next period. And then from there was a question of how do you deal with mistakes? Because tit for tat is great in that it cooperates with cooperation and it punishes defection by defecting. But if there's a possibility of error, such that I try to cooperate with you, but by mistake I defect, if you're playing against tit for tat is going to retaliate by defecting, and then you're going to get locked into a cycle of retribution. And so then there was a lot of work in the 90s on how do you sort of deal with correcting mistakes, and Martin Novak was particularly active in that and suggested a couple of these strategies that were forgiving, basically, that would with either randomly forgive with some probability if the other person defected, or have various other mechanisms for fixing that. And then things started branching out from, instead of just pairwise interactions between two people, how do you support cooperation at larger scales? And that's where a lot of this work on reputation and signaling and partner choice and things like that came in. And I think that more or less brings us up to the fairly current times, where now there's been some of this shift from interaction structures that make cooperation advantageous, like repeated interactions or reputation, to the thing that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about recently, which is this more cognitive question of how does cooperation actually get implemented? Because all of these models that people have been making, going back to Trivers, are these sort of standard game theory type models where the agent just has a strategy that says, do this. And there's no psychology in it. There's no cognition. And so what we're trying to do in this recent work is bring some of the ideas from behavioral economics and cognitive psychology, the kind of stuff popularized by Danny Kahneman, of this trade-off between intuitive processes that are sort of easy and fast but relatively inflexible, versus deliberation, which is very flexible and sensitive to details but requires time and cognitive effort to employ, and sort of bringing those ideas and building them into these game theory models for evolution of cooperation. So we've been doing that, and basically the way to think about it is that most of the models basically say, here is a game, what's a good strategy for it? But in real life, you need to figure out how to play a whole range of different games. That is, to the extent that these games characterize different social interactions, there's lots of different interactions that you need to have. And so we make these models where sometimes you are having interactions that are like prisoner's dilemmas, and so it's in your self-interest to just defect. But other times you're having interactions that that involve future consequences. So they're repeated interactions, or reputation is at stake, or so on. And so it can actually be self-interested to cooperate. And so you're facing different kinds of situations, and you can have a sort of intuitive default response that's not sensitive to the type of situation. It just says cooperate or defect. Or you can pay a cost to stop and think and say, well, which kind of situation am I actually facing? And let me tailor my strategy accordingly. And then you can ask in a setup like that, what are optimal strategies, where optimal means a Nash equilibrium in game theory terms, or a strategy that's favored by evolution or by learning. And what we see is that if you're in a world where future consequences are significant, what we see is that if you're in a world where future consequences are sufficiently common, so that usually it's a good idea to be cooperating, then the optimal strategy has as its intuitive default cooperate, because typically that's going to work out well, but is sometimes willing to pay to deliberate if it has, if it's not too costly to deliberate, say in situations where you have enough time or you're not that tired or whatever, then you'll stop and deliberate. And if you realize that it's actually a one-shot game, that strategy overrides its default to cooperate and instead switches to defection. And so we see this strategy that is intuitively cooperative, but uses deliberation to defect in one-shot situations where it can get away with defecting. These strategies are optimal and are favored by natural selection. And so that's a clear sort of theoretical prediction, but I sort of straddle the worlds of these formal models that make predictions and then running actual experiments to try and test the predictions. And so there's, over the last 5 or 6 years, there's emerged a big body of actual empirical evidence around this question. We had this paper in 2012 that sort of brought a lot of attention to this question. And what we did is we had people play one of these games. There's a group of 4 people. They each get some money. They choose how much to keep for themselves and how much to contribute to a common project that benefits the other people in the group. And then we experimentally induced them to either rely more on intuition or rely more on deliberation. And some of the experiments, we did that by forcing some of the people to decide quickly and forcing the other people to stop and think about the decision beforehand. In other experiments, we did it by sort of having people remember a time in their life where they followed their intuition and it worked out well, or a time that they carefully reasoned and it worked out well, which kind of induced them to trust more their intuitive response or their deliberative response. And in both cases, we found that, as predicted by the theory, the people that were made to be more intuitive cooperated more, and the people that were made to be more deliberative wound up being more selfish and keeping more of the money for themselves. And then since that initial work, there's been a lot of interest in this, and I just had a paper published that did a meta-analysis of many experiments run by different labs asking the same question in slightly different ways. And what we found was totally consistent with the theory and with the initial results, where in situations where there's no future consequence, so it's in your clear self-interest to be selfish, then intuition leads to more cooperation than deliberation. And this was 51 experiments from 20 different labs with more than 15,000 participants. And it was a reasonably big effect size, too. On average, there was like 20% more contributed in the intuitive condition relative to the more deliberative condition. And so that suggests that when self-interest clearly favors not cooperating, deliberation makes you less cooperative. But then there was also a set of other experiments where there actually are future consequences. And so it actually can be in your self-interest to cooperate in order to get other people to cooperate with you. And there, deliberation doesn't undermine cooperation, because when you stop and think, you realize, oh, I should actually cooperate because it's in my self-interest. In these experiments, they're done using economic games, so in the sort of experimental economics tradition, where by and large the games are framed in a very abstract way about money. And so the way it works is they sort of try and avoid words like cooperation and defection and things like that. And instead, just each person gets some endowment of money. You choose how much to keep for yourself and how much to put into this common project. All of the contributions are doubled and split equally among the 4 people. What do you want to contribute? And so it's framed very neutrally to try and avoid sort of priming effects induced by one particular context or another. We have a couple of papers where we looked at what happened if you try and create a competitive frame. And so in these experiments, we told them, we still describe the game in the same way, but we say you're competing against the other people in your group, and the person that earns the most is the winner. And there wasn't actually any monetary prize, but it's just sort of symbolically framing it as competition. And we actually found that didn't change things that much. The effects that we find in these studies are effects on average, averaged over these 15,000 people. And there is a lot of variation across individuals. And there certainly is evidence of people who, after thinking about it, continue to be cooperative and who don't have their sort of cooperative impulses undermined. I think that the thing that there's not that much evidence of is people whose default is to be selfish, and then when they stop and think about it, be like, oh, well, actually, I should cooperate. But I think that there's a lot of people whose first impulse is to cooperate, and then even when they realize they're in a one-shot anonymous setting, they continue to cooperate because they have explicitly held moral values that say cooperating is good or being selfish is bad, or because they anticipate having sort of intuitive emotional responses afterwards that are negative. For example, a lot of people will say, I thought about it and I decided that I should still cooperate because if I didn't, I knew I would feel guilty afterwards. And so that sort of thing I see as the kind of intuitive or emotional system hijacking deliberation and saying, even though you could make more money, I'm going to force you to be cooperative because I'm going to make you feel bad afterwards about it. Martin Nowak started working on cooperation in the early 90s, and there was sort of 3 major categories, I would say, where Martin did a lot of work. One was on understanding the importance of forgiveness for dealing with mistakes, so that you don't derail sort of productive, repeated cooperative relationships. If the other person makes a mistake, you should be a fair amount of forgiving. So there's the strategy, generous tit for tat, and then win, stay, lose, shift, that are these strategies that correct errors and deal with that. Then he also did a lot of work on reputation and what he calls indirect reciprocity, understanding how you can get cooperation not just between pairs of people, but in groups. So if I cooperate with you, that will make another person more likely to cooperate with me. And so this same logic of reciprocity works in this more distributed setting. The internet and the sort of age of social media really does open up these vast new possibilities for reputation systems on a much bigger scale than was possible before. And I think of Yelp as a great example of this. It's a distributed reputation system. I think of one of the ways I think of Yelp is the tourist trap killer, because the idea of a tourist trap is they're like crappy restaurants that can still get a lot of business because it's only ever one-shot games. It's a tourist comes up, they go to the restaurant, they're like, ugh, that was terrible, but then they never go there again, and they don't know the other people that are going there, and so there's no reputational consequences. But Yelp allows us to build a distributed memory, and where you can leave your bad impression of things for everyone else to see. And so it really, I think, is a major force for basically for good, for like making businesses perform better by creating a distributed reputation system. Novak was doing all this different work on cooperation, and when I started graduate school, I took his class, and then I asked to join his lab. And my background before that had been doing computational models of electrical properties of heart cells, which was not amazingly interesting. And when I sort of found out about the prisoner's dilemma and evolution of cooperation, I just totally fell in love with it. I was like, this is so cool. This is like so much cooler than anything that I've seen before. As someone doing game theory and behavioral science, it's sort of embarrassing that my dad is an applied math professor and my mom was a therapist. And so this is the only possible way to exactly combine their two interests, was a sort of mathematical and quantitative analysis of human behavior. So I grew up in Ithaca. My dad was a professor at Cornell, and I went to Cornell undergrad. I started as a computer science major, and I did 3 semesters of computer science, and realized that at least at Cornell, computer science was about doing math and not about writing computer programs, which is what I liked. And so I switched into biology, and I did a senior thesis in computational biology, math model of electrical properties of electrical transfer and photosynthesis, so like plant biology. And I only ever took one psychology class in undergrad, which was psychology of music, because I played in rock bands. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. And so I did a second senior thesis in basically computer analysis of musical melodies and things like that. And then I worked at a biotech startup for a couple of years making math models of electrical properties of heart cells. And then I started my PhD at Harvard in systems biology, which is where I connected with Novak and got into cooperation. And at that juncture, I was faced with this question of, in grad school, what do you want to study? And I was coming out of the biomedical world at this startup. And I was in a program where basically everyone was doing biomedical stuff and health-oriented research, lots of cancer research. And at the time that I entered grad school, that same year, my mom was diagnosed with cancer. And so I was very much sort of feeling like I was in a place where I could do work that was really relevant to these problems. But I just so fell in love with the prisoner's dilemma and cooperation that I was compelled to study that. It was for me, it was very much a calling, where I'm just like, this is just so interesting. I can't stop thinking about this. This is what I'm gonna spend my life working on. And I just sort of fell in love with the topic in a way that made it super easy to spend all my time thinking and working on it, because I just really loved it. But I have sort of carried with me this understanding that I went down the road that I enjoyed more than the road that seemed sort of most useful. And a lot of what I've taken from that is the desire to try and also do something useful with the work that I'm doing on cooperation. So in addition to doing these kind of very abstract mathematical models and only slightly less abstract experimental economics studies in the lab, I've also been trying to work with real-world organizations, companies, and government organizations to apply the sort of lessons that we've learned from the theory and the lab in the real world. And to that end, I've started the Applied Cooperation Team with 2 economists, Erez Yoeli at Harvard and Sion Banat at Swarthmore, where we work with all these different kinds of organizations to try and promote real-world cooperation. It's sort of like pro-social consulting. We don't take money, we just get we want data, and we try and publish papers with what comes out of it, but doing things trying to increase charitable donations, increase sort of conservation, decrease environmental impact, things like that. An interesting feature of all of this work around how to promote cooperation, which basically all boils down to create future consequences for current actions, is all of those types of mechanisms can be used to enforce cooperative behavior that benefits others, but it can equally well be used to enforce any kind of behavior. And so in some sense, this is the sort of social norms that establish a social norm for something and say, I'll only help you or cooperate with you if you follow the social norm, that can be a tool that promotes sort of, the greater good if the social norms are norms that prescribe, pro-social behavior. But it can also reinforce all kinds of negative behavior if norms prescribe the negative behavior. And so like reputation, there's nothing inherently pro-social promoting about reputation effects. It's just a tool to get people to do whatever you want them to do. And so all of these tools can be, basically can cut both ways. Thaler and Sunstein's nudge idea is connected to all these kinds of things that I'm interested in a couple of different ways. One part is the applied angle. It's saying trying to use these sort of insights from behavioral science to influence people. And then you have to have the question of what are you trying to get people to do, and what you are using the nudges for may not be what I would want them to be used for. And so for any of this applied stuff, this is an issue that like we're creating tools and then different people are going to use the tools to do different things. I don't really know what to do about that other than to say I hope that the people use the tools the way that I would want them to use them. But that's the nature of creating tools. There's also an important sort of scientific distinction between the actual nudge stuff, like what Thaler meant by nudge, and most of what I am doing, which is that the nudges were supposed to not fundamentally change the incentive structure. That nudges are gentle. That is the whole idea of nudge, is you don't actually change someone's action set or change the payoffs associated with things. You just present things in a way that makes certain options seem more attractive or whatever. Whereas a lot of the stuff that we're doing with making behavior observable to other people, making reputation consequences, things like that, that fundamentally changes the strategic nature of the decision. Mm-hmm. So in some sense, it's more heavy-handed than the nudge stuff. I think that there's been a lot of interest on this work that I've been doing, applying this intuition versus deliberation framework to cooperation, because in some sense, the question is ancient. Like it goes at least back to Aristotle. It's been having these discussions about, are we by default cooperative or by default selfish? But I think what I'm sort of bringing to it is trying to actually get real empirical evidence to answer this question, rather than either philosophizing about it or making sort of abstract theoretical models to try and actually say, well, how are ways we can actually look at this in the lab? And so leveraging a lot of this system 1, system 2 dual process kind of work that Kahneman has been one of the leaders on, there's this whole set of tools now for exploring these things in the lab. And so the fact that we did this and we come up with these results that people found very counterintuitive, because most people have this expectation that we are by default selfish. I think there's evidence that actually there's a lot of situations where we're by default cooperative, has captured a lot of interest and created a lot of controversy because it goes contrary to many people's preconceptions. Mm-hmm. When I was at Harvard, in addition to working with Martin Novak, someone that I spent a lot of time with was Josh Green in the psych department. And Josh is actually the one that introduced me to all of these ideas about intuition and deliberation and cognitive processes. And so Josh has done a lot of work that is very related to the things that I care about, and was sort of inspirational for. He hasn't thought that much about cooperation, more about these sort of moral dilemmas. But it was sort of getting exposed to that there is what led me to think about, I should apply this set of tools to understand cooperation, which is the thing that I care the most about. And someone else who was in Josh's lab at the same time I was, who's doing extremely cool work in this domain, is Fiery Cushman, now happily also at Harvard. And Fiery is doing really fascinating work on understanding lots of different kinds of pro-social behaviors from a cognitive perspective, looking at sort of model-free versus model-based reasoning. So situations where you have a clear like model of the world that thinks through all the details versus a sort of general, just kind of reinforcement learning based, like no model, no explicit understanding, just, oh, that feels good, I like to do that kind of framework. There are also some people in psychology and sociology that have been talking about ideas like this in a kind of abstract sense for a long time. Like Toshio Yamagishi is this very influential Japanese sociologist who had these ideas around exchange heuristics and people sort of treating relationships as if there's important exchange, as if they were relationships that involved back and forth and a possibility for exchange even when they don't. And also a lot of the evolutionary psychologists, people like Tooby and Cosmides, have for a long time been making arguments about people's psychology carrying around imprints of earlier behaviors. They think about it more in a sort of biological, like hard-coded modules in the brain for different kinds of things. And I more think of these things in terms of learning and reinforcement of basically developing different kinds of rules of thumb for different social situations. Another person that's very relevant for these kinds of things is Gigerenzer, with these kind of ideas of heuristics and rules of thumb being useful and encoding sort of typically useful behaviors or being advantageous. And so one way of looking at what I'm doing is taking a lot of those ideas and looking at it in the social context and how those things work in the context of interpersonal relationships rather than just individual choice. A big question in a lot of this work, and in terms of thinking about the intuitions, what your intuitions are, is some people think of them in terms of biologically hard-coded instincts that were the result of evolution. Other people think of them as learned heuristics or rules of thumb. And I think in different domains, both of those things are real. But in terms of cooperation, it seems to me much more likely that it's going to be sort of learned rules of thumb, because if you are going to evolve an optimal agent, whether cooperating or defecting is the best, is sort of adaptive, depends on what the other people are doing. There's nothing that makes cooperation across the board payoff maximizing. It's just that things like reputation and repetition can make it so that if everybody else is cooperative, you should also be cooperative. And so it seems like you don't want to hard code agents to be cooperative. You want to evolve agents that can learn what kind of environment they're in and adjust their strategy accordingly. So I'm an associate professor at Yale in the psychology department, with also appointments in economics and in management. And sort of straddling those areas is very much, sort of who I am. I think of myself as a behavioral scientist. Fundamentally, I'm interested in understanding behavior. And I think actually the fact that my training was in biology, which isn't related to any of the things that I'm doing now, has been very useful in terms of having me not be sort of raised and indoctrinated with a particular social sciences way of thinking about things, but instead I sort of came to all of these questions sort of fairly late in my training, and so was able to say, what about the way psychologists do things is cool and makes sense? What about the way economists do things cool, makes sense? Let me try and sort of put those together. And so in terms of looking forward, I'm getting more and more interested in and invested in these sort of real world applications. And so I feel like in the next phase of my career, that's something that I particularly want to invest in, is, how do we do something useful with the things that we're learning, and how do we find, not just in the labs, we've got lots of lab experiments that present evidence for these kinds of theories we're developing, but it's a long way from these very stripped down abstract lab situations to the mess of the real world. My vision of who is going to be interested in this and interested in using these ideas in the real world is, on the one hand, governments, since regardless of their particular political leanings, I think in general, governments are interested in trying to improve the welfare of their citizens. And there's disagreements about how exactly to do that, but that's generally the goal of a lot of countries. And so I think the these ideas that we have been developing are very useful for lots of different levels of government. So that's one set of people that I hope will be interested in this, and the other is large companies and organizations that are interested in how do they get their workforce to be most efficient. Because if you think about the way companies work, it's the exact same kind of cooperation problem where what you're trying to do is you're trying to, in the best of all worlds, you would have each of your employees operating in the way that would be best for the organization as a whole. So these same tools for sort of aligning individual incentives and collective incentives are super important for organizations sort of maximizing their productivity. Another direction that I've recently gotten very interested in, and this has really been driven by my brilliant graduate student, Jillian Jordan, is signaling and the role that signaling plays in a lot of social behaviors. And in addition to wanting to help other people, even when there's no personal benefit to doing so, there's also a lot of evidence, both from the lab and from Twitter and things like that, that people also are motivated to sanction bad behavior, punish wrongdoers, condemn wrongdoers, shame wrongdoers, or people they see as wrongdoers, even when they're not personally affected by the wrongdoing. And so there's been a lot of interest in understanding why people engage in this kind of punishing behavior. And so we have been advocating the idea that, at least in part, that kind of behavior can be a form of signaling. And in particular, if you punish someone for doing something or you condemn someone for doing something, that's a way to signal that you don't do the behavior that is being engaged in. And so we have these laboratory experiments. We show that if people punish selfishness, other people assume that they're more trustworthy. But that's only true if they don't have a better way of assessing trustworthiness, which suggests that the punishment really is serving as a signal rather than, some sort of other function. And so I think that this can explain a lot of behavior, particularly a lot of the public shaming and condemnation behavior, where you can get these kind of runaway situations where punishment and condemnation is vastly disproportionate to how bad the action is, where if you were punishing for sort of some kind of real social good target, it's clearly much too much punishment, but it makes sense if you think that a lot of the punishment and condemnation is actually just signaling. Then you don't really care about the consequences, you care about showing something about yourself. The kinds of experiments we use to explore this are these two-stage experiments where in the first stage, you see someone act selfishly towards a third person, and then you have some money and you have the choice to either punish that person for being selfish or not. And then you go on to a second stage where someone else has the choice to trust you or not. And by trust, this means they have some money and they choose how much to send to you. Whatever they send to you gets tripled, and then you decide how much to give back. So if they think that you're going to be fair and send money back to them, it's worth it for them to transfer the money to you. You can both benefit. But if they think you're selfish, then they wouldn't transfer to you because they would expect you to just keep whatever you get. And so our lab and also several other labs have found that people trust punishers more than non-punishers. So if I see you punish someone, so if in the first stage I punish someone else for being selfish, then in the second stage, this new person is more likely to send money to me, expecting that I will be trustworthy and return the money. And then what we showed is not only is there this expectation, but that actually motivates behavior. So people are more likely to engage in punishment in the first stage when that's going to be a useful means for them signaling in the second stage compared to when it's not. So it suggests that a real motive for this kind of behavior is actually trying to signal your trustworthiness. There's another interesting dimension of signaling that relates to all of my work on intuition and cooperation, which is the argument that I've made thus far has been the reason people are intuitively cooperative is that intuition gives you this sort of rule of thumb that's fast and easy to apply. And so, it's sort of a good, just like baseline to say, I should be cooperative. But we actually have a recent paper, this was again with my extremely talented student, Jillian Jordan, that it provides experimental evidence that another motivation for behaving in a kind of intuitive way is reputational benefits and signaling, which is to say that if I see you cooperate without thinking about it, without taking into account the details, then I know that you're not going to be easily swayed by incentives. So if I say, well, you just cooperate without thinking whether it's in your self-interest, then if I interact with you later, I can count on you to cooperate, even if it turned out to be costly to do so. Mm-hmm. Whereas if I see you stop, carefully consider, and say, oh, yes, okay, I'll help you, then I know, well, next time you might not actually help me. And so the desire to signal that you are a trustworthy partner and therefore someone good to interact with can motivate you to cooperate in an uncalculating way to broadcast your trustworthiness. Mm-hmm. And I think that this actually relates to is a sort of broadly applicable thing, that when people see others being calculating, they don't trust them. For this sort of reason. And a place that we're seeing a lot of discussion of this right now is in politics. And I think a lot of it is applying this kind of idea from interpersonal relationships, where if you ask a friend to do a favor for you and they say, well, how long is it going to take? How much of a pain is it going to be? And then they're like, okay, fine, I'll do you the favor. Like, that does not get you nearly as many friend points as a friend that just says, oh yeah, sure, I'll help you, without asking about it.